Welcome to the Surrogacy Warrior podcast with your host, Kimberly Surratt. Join us as we dive deep into the heart of surrogacy, offering insights, sharing stories, and providing advice. Our mission is to illuminate every corner of surrogacy, from the emotional roller coasters and legal battles to the triumphant moments of birth and beyond. Surrogacy Warrior is more than just a podcast. It's a community for anyone touched by or interested in the transformative power of surrogacy. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, lawyersforfamilies.com. Now here's the host of Surrogacy Warrior, Kimberly Surratt.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Surrogacy Warrior. This is the podcast where we navigate the incredible journey of surrogacy and assisted reproduction in order to get there, all these wonderful pathways for becoming families. Today, we are talking to Dr. Carrie Bedient, one of my favorite doctors. Dr. Bedient, I just have to say, is the example of that doctors can be human. They can be real kind human beings and normal people and approachable. And that's what I love about you. But welcome, Dr. Bedient.
Thank you so much for having me on. Your check, or maybe chocolate, is totally in the mail for saying all those lovely things, because I feel exactly the same way about you in terms of flipping the script for lawyers. And oh, hey, someone, you really do care. You're very thoughtful. You're very conscientious. So the Mutual Admiration Society works in both directions.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. Mutual Admiration Society. So with our audience right now, though, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, and exactly what you do?
So I'm a fertility specialist and have all the schooling that goes along with that. So, Washington University for college, and then University of Arizona for med school, Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio for residency for OBGYN, and then Emory for fellowship. So I have all the credentials, I have all the letters. I am currently a physician at the Fertility Center of Las Vegas, and so we do quite a lot of surrogacy, egg donation, both with domestic patients as well as international patients. And so my two partners and I spend quite a lot of time of that. I also host a podcast called Fertility Docs Uncensored, which is geared towards patients and helping them understand the morass that is IVF, because my podcasting co-host and I discovered that really Dr. Google went to a very questionable medical school. And so we're trying to keep people off of Google and into a place where you can really reliably essentially listen in on three docs having just chit chat about, oh, what are you doing here? How does this work? Explaining it to people in the way that they want to hear it, in terms of using words that are not 25 syllables long. And so spend a fair amount of time doing all those things. I'm married. I've got two kids. I have a small dog who runs the house. I haven't seen control of my TV remote in years. So kind of all the usual stuff.
Well, it's I love the description of your podcast, because I think what we're going to try to accomplish with Surrogacy Warrior, and especially today too, is also to demonstrate how lawyers work with the doctors. Surrogacy is just such a specialized industry where I can't think. I mean, maybe somewhat in personal injury with car accidents, there's interaction between doctors and lawyers at a high level, but this is different. This is much more collaborative.
And we assume that you guys know a lot of the medicine, even though we really have absolutely no right to assume that. But you deal with such intricate parts of creating these contracts where the medicine is very, very relevant. And so you're honorary MDs at times.
You're an honorary JD at times. So the topic I really want to talk to you about today really hits on that, because this is what we want to talk about, or what I want to get to and really help the public with understanding, is talking about egg donation and anonymity, or the lack thereof. For the legal industry, anonymity's become quite a facade. It's not real anymore in the genetic sense. But I really want to kind of cross over that conversation between the legal part of this and the physician view on this. I think maybe you could help the public understand a little bit about the FDA part of that and the known donor part of it versus the unknown donor.
Sure. So there's a couple of layers of this. Whenever we are working with a donor, whether it's egg donor or sperm donor, who's carrying that an intended parent is carrying that pregnancy, or a donor from the perspective of a couple, however that couple is made up, using their eggs and sperm in a gestational carrier is carrying the pregnancy. Those are all considered donor scenarios. So parentage is relevant here because you typically have a different person contributing gametes, meaning eggs and sperm, than you do carrying the pregnancy, than necessarily who's going to take that baby home and be the responsible parent. And so within the eyes of the FDA regulates egg and sperm donation in the same way that they regulate donation of a kidney or a lung or a heart. And so that has some very specific rules attached to it. So anybody who's coming in for any kind of donation, so let's go with egg donation for the purposes of this conversation, she has to have a specific set of lab work that is done in very close proximity to those eggs coming out and being used. She has to have a very specific physical exam, a very long questionnaire that is a risk assessment questionnaire. And so all those things have to be done in order to donate to somebody else who is going to be exposed to those eggs in the way of carrying the pregnancy. So that's kind of the groundwork for the FDA testing that needs to be done. Now, the next thing that plays into this is whether or not this is an anonymous donation versus a known donation. And so this is entirely an FDA construct, and it also plays a role with other organ donation as well. So for example, it's very common for someone who donated a lung to somebody or a heart for the recipient to never know who the donor is. Now, part of that's practical because if you've given up a lung or a heart, probably not around to have that conversation later. But families are involved, and so it's a little bit of a different world. With egg donation, sperm donation, and then carrying a pregnancy, all those people are very much in this world, living in it, and will be for quite some time, hopefully. And so there's anonymous donations where the names of these people are never shared. They don't get that information up front. And then there's known donation where those names are shared. And known donation doesn't imply that they're best buddies having drinks together on a Friday night. Known donation implies you know that Sally Smith gave eggs to Mr. and Mrs. Brown. And so when you have a completely anonymous donation, someone has to absolutely nail every one of those FDA requirements. Otherwise, it has to be known. And so there's a lot of implications in that when you look at the surrogacy world in particular, and when you look at the known versus unknown and how that plays out in the real world with genetic testing and how that works currently and what technologies are available to anybody off the street.
Right. Well, so key into the legal side of this. So this is this yin and yang I wanted to get to today. Mm-hmm. And on the parentage end of it, while some people may believe in their heart and soul that the legal industry and the parentage side of things grew up with a very different contract for anonymous versus known, and that there's some legal construct behind that, there really isn't on the parentage side of things. Parentage, in the way the parentage statutes developed, were based on intent to donate and intent to receive that donation, intent to give up any parental rights you may have over that donation versus maintain those rights. So when I say maintain, it's because some people are having egg retrievals, but they're still keeping their eggs. They're not donating them every time, to be really clear for the public. And in the parentage side of things, lawyers developed anonymous contracts to play along with the need for the FDA end of things, for the need of what the medical industry needed. But we're not concerned about that. If the parties know each other versus don't know each other, doesn't change the bare bones requirement of I had to have the intent to donate, and you had the intent to receive. I had the intent to not keep any parental rights over any future children, and you had the intent to receive that donation to have parental rights in the future. Anonymity doesn't play into that. That's not what we need for parentage. But what I started the conversation with was about the facade of anonymity and what kind of the dilemma it causes us with the FDA still going down this path. Now, the FDA needs to go down that path, right? I mean, I assume the medical
be
behind it because there's good reasons behind it.
right. If you're carrying a pregnancy for someone else, or you're accepting someone else's tissue, it needs to be held to a higher standard, because this is at its heart elective. And while you may be very attached to a particular donor or surrogate, you don't have to use that exact person. If there's a medical reason not to, then you don't. And so it's a much more flexible in some respects, in that you could switch out an egg donor conceivably. You can't switch out a wife. They get very angry when you do that. You can switch out an egg donor, you can switch out a surrogate, you can switch out a sperm donor. You can't switch out a life partner. And so things that you accept in the world of parentage, where it's entirely included within two partners, become much more flexible outside that. At the same time, they become more rigid, because nobody wants to endanger anyone else. This is truly an elective process. No one is going to expire imminently if they don't use a particular egg donor, sperm donor, surrogate. And so we have to be very strict with that, because first, do no harm. And so that plays a role in it. And when you think about kind of the history of IVF and fertility and donation, especially, if you think about this 50 years ago, when you had mostly sperm donation at that point, because nobody could get the eggs out reliably, when you had sperm donation, you could conceivably have, somebody walk in off the street, ejaculate into a cup, they prep the sample, the woman come in through another doorway, never seen, never knowing who it is whose sperm is being given, and she gets the insemination. And there was no technology at that point that would even allow anybody else outside of the doctor, the woman, and the donor to know that a donation ever occurred. And the donor and the recipient never knew each other. And that was the standard. It was the gold standard. It was socially acceptable and what was expected. And so, in 1975, that's reasonable. Well, in 2024, you've got 23andMe, you've got Ancestry.com, you've got facial recognition software on any number of social media sites and through the internet. And so what was not identifiable 50 years ago is now imminently easy to find. I mean, how many people have gone back through Facebook to try and track down your ex-boyfriend's first girlfriend, or the person who came in later? It's so easy to do, and people don't necessarily realize you can do that with donors too. So anonymity is completely to make the donors and or recipients feel better, because nobody else has any illusions that actually exists anymore.
Right. But yet, we're trying to create contracts for anonymous donations to meet that FDA requirement. But lawyers are sitting there racking their brains going, when we know they can still figure out the identity, what do we draft? How do we write a contract that, within my legal ethics and my requirements as a lawyer is still ethical? It's still, it doesn't create a facade for the client who goes, well, wait a minute, 15 years down the road, when everybody's found each other, going, well, you lawyer, you told me this was anonymous. And I didn't. I said, we're doing an anonymous contract, but we've got to be careful and say that it's not real.
Mhm.
Now, other than the 23andMe and Ancestry.com, there's another trend that is impacting and changing your field and my field all at the same time, which is the concept of whether it's a human rights issue to know who your genetic donor was, meaning that it should potentially never be anonymous.
Mhm.
And the impact on me is that we're seeing legislative changes, and Colorado is one of them. And there are groups and entities that are donor-conceived individuals who have very passionate, strong feelings about this. From the clinic side, the shift towards fewer and fewer anonymous, I'm assuming it's having an impact on the clinic. It's or just the way you do things, I assume, and the conversations you have with clients now.
Yeah, and as we've been talking, I've been kind of thinking about the idea that the FDA is driving all of this, and to a degree they are. They drive the testing, but really the people who drive whether this is known or anonymous are the donors and the intended parents themselves. Because when someone comes to us and says, "Hey, I want to be an egg donor and I'm fine with my name being out there," we kind of default include to that. If an IP comes and says, "I only want a known donor," or "I only want an anonymous donor," or a donor says, "I only want to be anonymous," they're the ones driving it. Because when someone comes and they say, "I want to be known, I want to be anonymous," we just say, "Okay, fine," and we pull out the appropriate set of protocols and make sure that they have the appropriate paperwork done. And so now that there is much more of a push to be completely known, it's important to consider where we came from and where we are now and how rapidly things change. So going back to the 1975, sperm donation only. By the time you get to 1995, you start to have IVF being done. The concept of egg donation becomes more real. And by the time you get to 2024, you've got this concept of egg banks where one donor could potentially give to quite a few families and help them build their families. And so when someone comes in and says they want to be known or they have to be known, that when it's a direct one-to-one relationship, meaning one donor gives her eggs to one couple, that is much more streamlined because it happens in real time. Everything is going to one place. And it's much easier to say, okay, this is the set of parents, this is the donor, this is the connection, even if it's just an email address where you guys are able to communicate and contact whenever you need, which is typically not now. I mean, typically it's several years down the road when a child has something, needs something, or wants something. So that's very easy. It's the concept of egg banking that makes this really challenging from everybody's perspective. Because if you have one donor who, let's say, gives 25 eggs, that could very easily be split into 2, 3, 4 lots. So it could go to conceivably 2 or 3, 4 families. That doesn't mean 24 eggs become 24 children. I kind of wish it did because everybody's life would be easier if the technology was that good. But what it means is that you've got these lots going to different places. And so when you have a known donor in there, you need to be able to close the loop on all of this. And as a clinic, that's not what we're good at. What we're good at is the science, the technology, being very precise. Tracking down somebody, that's not what we went to school for, and it's not in our list of things that we can do or that we have staffing to do. And so when you get this dichotomy between who's known and who's not, and you've got eggs that are frozen that may not be used for another 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, that makes that tracking down later much more difficult. And so what we're trying to figure out is the logistics of how to do this, because it is a royal pain in the neck to make sure that we are promising something that we can then deliver on, not impair anybody's anonymity if they want to keep it, not keep things from children that they may want to know in the future, because that has progressed pretty significantly too. 50 years ago, there wasn't necessarily a drive to know who your biological parents was in the same way that there is now, because everybody has all kinds of information at their fingertips 24/7.
I would say that it's always been there. It's always been an underlying thing. And the only reason we can say that from a legal perspective is if we learn the lessons from the adoption industry and
Mhm.
what has happened historically over the years. In the 50s, there was a mass number of births where women were shuffled away to a pregnancy home so that no one knew she was pregnant as a teenager to give birth and forced to have her child adopted. And they were all closed adoptions back then. And if we learn anything from that, we look to today, and the shift went from closed adoptions to open adoptions, to, from lying to children and not telling them they were adopted, to having relationships still with their bio parents or some form of connection to their bio parents. Why? Because psychologically, society demanded it over time. They
Mhm.
demanded that this was a need, that somehow people have this inherent psychological need to know where they came from, who they came from genetically. And there's a lot of debate about that. But my favorite part about what you brought up is, okay, this is where we are now, and we're still trying to work within the needs and desires of society and what people want
Mhm.
now, today, maybe looking at the future of where we may end up. If I had a crystal ball as a lawyer, I'd say we're going to end up with nothing anonymous. Uh,
Mhm.
and I really think that's where it's going. And you may have patients, I don't know, from your perspective, and this is kind of that organic conversation about, patients who are passionate about it continuing to be anonymous. What do you see as their drive, or what are their conversations with you about why?
So I think that probably the biggest driver of anonymous is the donors themselves, because they're the ones where these women are typically between 21 and 30 years of age. Most donors tend to be on the younger 21 to 25 version of that, end of that. And they are they are more than willing to give this gift. They are more than willing to put themselves at risk, which is inherently what going through the medications and the procedure is. They are willing to give something of themselves that someone else doesn't have and needs in order to build a family, which is a very fundamental. I mean, very few people argue with someone's right to have a family, and many people are generous enough to say, I can help, let me do that. But one of the conditions of this gift is, I will give you this gift, but I don't want this gift to boomerang back on me. I don't want to give you a car and then be responsible for the car payments or the insurance, or even just taking it into the shop. If someone else is paying for it, I don't want to have to take it into the shop. And so that's where some of the biggest concern comes in, because the donors come in, and without the donors, this doesn't exist. Period. End of story. The intended parents, many of them are a little bit more willing to do whatever the donor wants. And so we'll get to the intended parents in a second. But the donors are really driving this, because if they are not comfortable with the situation, it doesn't happen. All the good clinics, like if I see any sign of hesitation in a donor, I don't want her in this program, even no matter how beautiful, talented, brilliant she is. If she's got a reservation about it, I don't want her to have that reservation. I want her to be 100% clear. Yep, I want to do this. And so when the donors come through and they say, look, I don't want 20 years from now, when I have children of my own and a family and a career, I don't want to see somebody on my doorstep who is demanding their biological information, even if it's not a relationship, who wants that information. Like, look, I don't want to have that interaction. I don't want that complication. I gave this gift to someone else. This is now their gift to manage. And so most of them aren't arguing with the ability to, hey, in the past 20 years, we now have a family history of heart attack, stroke, and diabetes. That's not really the issue. It's more the complexity of a relationship that may stem when it's a relationship that they didn't cultivate, they didn't grow, and is not ultimately their responsibility. And so I see a lot of the conflict there, where when we routinely ask donors, hey, are you willing to be known? Almost always the answer is no. There's a decent split between no and I want more information. Very, very few people say yes, straight up.
It's interesting because when I have my conversations with them too, and they're anonymous. It's my legal duty to make sure they understand what that means and understand that 23andMe, Ancestry.com exists. There's others, but those are the two that always come to mind. That these companies exist and that DNA testing can blow that right out of the water for them. I have a split of conversations with them. I get a little bit of, yeah, I know that, but I still want to try for anonymous. I still want it to say anonymous right here. I know it may not exist. It may not ever, they could still show up on your doorstep. That's the bizarre thing. If anybody hasn't done that testing, I've never done it because I'm scared of it, because I'm a lawyer, because
Same. I'm willing to be blissfully ignorant on that particular matter. And maybe when
I live in a world of Armageddon, and I'm scared to death of that test. I just don't want to know. But
you know how that even you and I is that all it takes is one of our siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles to do it, and boom, we're still connected. Like they can still find us even though we never did it.
Yep, my mother did it, and as soon as she did it, I went, okay, well, there we are. Here we are. We're in the database. So everybody, just so everybody knows, everybody says, well, I don't have anything to hide. You'd be amazed how many of your family members have something to hide. As a family law attorney, back to Armageddon, a lot of them have something to hide. They never told the family about that one child they gave up for adoption. That's where a lot of this stems from, is that stuff coming out and coming to play. Or we hear stories now about, oh my goodness, my dad was a sperm donor and I never knew it. And now there are siblings out there, half siblings, etc. I mean, there's all kinds of stories. But yeah, the psychology of a donor and saying to them, well, this is the reality. And they go, yeah, but I still want to keep it this way. But for my conversations, a lot of times it's like, well, okay, I don't mind being known, but they need to be known. It's like a tit for tat kind of a reaction of the recipients. If I know who the recipients are, then they can know who I am. Yeah. Otherwise, no, they can't know who I am. I'm keeping it secret. Do you get that kind of reaction too?
From the IP side, intended parent side, I see more of I'm important. Nobody can know that I have a child that did not originate from my eggs. And the definition of importance varies widely from person to person. But I have some people who they want to know who the donor is because they want as much information as possible. They don't want the donor to know anything about them because they feel like that part of their identity is not anyone's business. And of course, once somebody else knows, door is open for any amount of information to come out. And once the information's out, whether it was supposed to get out or not, it's out. And so I mostly see that from a lot of my IPs. I don't have these discussions as much, mostly because we're so in all of the medical details that they leave a lot of the known versus anonymous to their discussions with you. But a lot of them will say, oh, I want to know everything about her, but she can't know anything about me because I don't want her to, for privacy reasons, for publicity reasons, for any number of things.
The conversation I have with a lot of them is, this is attorney-client privilege, right? Correct. Yes, we have confidentiality. I'm your lawyer. And they say, I already found her. I know who she is. And she thinks she's anonymous. So, and there's a lot of that. That's how that happens. We have donor profiles. She's a certain age. One of the things you're really proud about in choosing her as a donor is she went to a certain college and she's a certain kind of athlete. You know her age, you know the approximate years she was in college, you know which sport she played in college, And you know that she's blonde haired and a certain height, because we know the characteristics of the donor. All that's on the internet. It's not hard to go to a college website, look up the team from that year for that sport. There's only 2 or 3 females. You know, she lived in a certain proximity of the clinic because travel costs weren't too bad. And here we are. It really takes very little, quite honestly. Social media has destroyed a lot of that ability just off of the profiles. And so, yeah, that's a lot of my conversations with them. In terms of why the intended parents want to stay anonymous, you're right. I'm seeing there's a lot less conversation about them staying anonymous. It is becoming more, I've got 20 years in this industry now, and I have definitely seen the trend away from anonymous. I've seen the trend towards the human rights arguments and the beliefs that it is a human rights issue for their child to be able to connect or know who that donor was at some age, some appropriate age that parents, everybody has a different thought on what the appropriate age is. Statutorily, what's happening in the country is people are looking at 18. I don't know that that's a magic medical number, that somehow a child is psychologically prepared to know something like that at 18. I can't emphasize enough that 18-year-olds are not, frontal lobes are not fully developed.
They're not fully myelinated. Like all of the sheathing to make these neural pathways function at peak capacity, like that doesn't happen until you're in your 20s. And so you may be able to vote at 18 and join the military and all these other things, but your like you said, your frontal lobe is not necessarily all there yet.
So the trend we've seen in the legal interaction with clinics, we saw high interaction of lawyers with contracts for donations in the beginning of my career 20 years ago, to almost very, very, very little interaction with lawyers on donor contracts, because a lot of it was being done through clinics, consent forms through clinics, to now reestablishing that connection with lawyers being involved in donations again, especially because if it's going to be known, there's a different issue for the lawyers as far as what does that interaction look like? What does that relationship look like? Because it's not a relationship. I don't want it to be. I want the recipients to maintain full parental control. And, I get variations of people asking for different, well, I want just to be known, or I want pictures, or I want contact. You don't get to demand contact as a donor. So, this path we're on is kind of circled back to where we were at the beginning of when I first started doing this work. But for you, logistically, you brought it up some about you're not built for known donation. Maybe that's not the right word. You're not built for anonymous and then helping them if there's a need for transfer of medical information or genetic information that arises later.
Right. So when we sometimes we see this where you've got a child that was born 15 years ago, and now there's some new diagnosis, or they were born last year and there's some new diagnosis, and they want to go back to the donor and ask. And donors in general tend to be pretty easy going with that information. Like all we have to do is say, hey, this child was born with X. Can you please give us this information? Are you willing to go get a blood draw to have this test done? Things like that. But it's going through us as a fertility clinic, and that's not what we're built for, because a lot of these conditions are very specialized. They're not what we do on a daily basis. And so the intricacies of those parts of diagnosis are not known to us. And so it's one thing to go and ask a series of questions once, maybe twice, but when there's a lot of back and forth of, okay, well, what about this and what about this and what about this, every couple of days, a new piece of information, we're not built for that. And we also don't want to harass the donor. Like, we want the parent and the kid to get what they need, but we also acknowledge that, look, the donor gave this gift and the gift has been given. And so it's walking that line between making sure everybody is taken care of with all the information they need. And we're just not built for that. I don't have the staffing for that. We don't have the expertise for that. In multiple different areas, not just physical man hours, but the knowledge of, okay, it's not just this question, it's these other 6 questions that are relevant that the IP should have asked, didn't know to ask. Well, we don't necessarily know to ask those either. And so it poses a challenge. It poses a challenge.
I think it's misinformation in the public too, because by the time they get to me and I say, so how are you going to exchange this information? Oh, we'll do it through the clinic. No.
No, that's not.
They want to be your doctor today, not your doctor for the next 50 years, 60 years. They want to only do their service. And they say, okay, well, then you. Well, I would like to retire someday too. So, and I don't plan on into eternity continuing to track every donation contract I've ever been connected with. And I'm not built that way as a lawyer either. So, the tools they're a little bit limited in what we have these days, other than be a known donation, and there's no issue. You know who each other are, you're able to contact each other, and this goes away. But do you think this trend on that, you mentioned, donors and their desire, I mean, does it impact the availability of people willing to donate if we move and shift where it looks like we're going to shift, which is to zero anonymous?
As it stands right now, if I told every donor walking through the door, you have to be known, our donor volume would drop like a rock.
Yeah.
Because they're just, and part of it is it would be a change. And so you would have to have everybody shifting to the exact same thing all at once, which of course isn't going to happen. You've got early adopters who are trying to do the right thing. And then you've got people who are more willing to keep going with the status quo until they have to change. But everybody would have to make the change all at once. And there would have to be some track record of how it works. And there is a track record right now, but it's a track record with people who are willing to do it from the beginning. And that is a different subset of people. And so, right now, if we had to give if everyone had to be known, our donor pool would just plummet because, a lot of 21, 22-year-olds are not willing to say, oh yeah, when I'm 42, I'm willing to be contacted by this kid so that they can get more information.
I'm going to do my soapbox for 2 seconds too, just because there's a enormous push around the country for donor release information statutes, for the shift away from anonymous. And it's being done without a lot of foresight and not, in my opinion, a lot of conversations that need to be done with the right parties, which is the lawyers and the doctors, as to how and what makes it practical. It's easy. The world's easy when everybody agrees to it being known and it's just a done deal. It's super simple. Mm-hmm. But Colorado's a prime example. It was done without input from the lawyers. It was shoved down their throats, middle of the night type of stuff. And the donor conceived groups can argue that it wasn't, but it was. And they are now struggling with what the regulations look like. Because, like you said, it can't just be an overnight, hey, we're one thing today and we're another thing tomorrow. It's not that simple. It takes a lot more communication and work.
And you can see that just our one clinic, as we've been trying to negotiate, all right, how do we make this work? And we've been in, how many meetings have we had? How many conversations? How many hours of discussion just on this one tiny issue of how do we make sure that the contracts are legal and that everybody is doing what they want to do? How do we make it not onerous for anybody involved? Whenever you start to increase the complexity, you increase the expense in an already extraordinarily expensive process. And so we've been working on this for at least 7 or 8 months now, and we still don't have the final plan in place, even though I really hope we're close.
Me too.
But the staff members who are in charge of this, they are terrified that they're going to make a mistake as they're going through this, because they hold themselves to the same level of perfectionism that all the rest of us do, and they want to make sure that they're doing right by everybody involved, and they're so anxious about, we're going to have more known donors, and how do we do this, and how do we make sure that everybody's identity is maintained in the way that it needs to be. And they're very, very meticulous about that, and they're worried about, okay, what do we have to change? Are we going to do anything? Is everybody going to be happy?
Well, anonymous is that way already too, though. I mean, it is excruciatingly scary, especially when it comes between you to me. As a lawyer, the concept of an anonymous contract really doesn't truly exist in the law. It's contract is meeting of minds of parties that know each other. It's business deals, it's real estate transactions, right? It's parenting agreements between people who know each other. And so to do separate signature pages, whether I like it or not, become the holder of that secret. And I don't really have professional ethics rules that allow me to be a holder of a secret from my client. In some ways, it can be argued that I am a mandated, the second I know who the donor is, that I can't keep something secret from my client. It's just that we agree that that's what we're going to do. And they don't ask me for the information because that's what we've agreed to do. But it's a shift that I don't mind, because it scares me to death to be in an anonymous world. That one email slips through with the names on it, or goes to the wrong party. And the contract has, we've got different versions, the version without the signature pages attached and the one with them attached. Which one goes to who, and did the wrong file get attached at some point or disclosed at some point?
Yeah. And a lot of this is really complicated by the egg banks, which is, it's a good problem to have, because it means the technology has improved considerably. We no longer need 30 eggs in order to get one kid. We can accomplish it with 8, 10, 12. But it means that there's a much tighter lock that has to be kept on who is getting what eggs, where are they going, and what are the disclosure agreements around it. And that's where, especially when you look at it 5 years down the line, having to track down a donor who, she easily could have moved states, gotten married, changed her name, started an entirely different career than what was listed on our intake form. And so finding her all of a sudden, it requires a private investigator, and that's not what we do. And so having to track her down later to honor the rest of the agreement is really challenging, because she doesn't want to do a donation that then doesn't get used, because maybe one egg lot got used and the other 2 or 3 didn't. And so we can't continue to use what she worked very hard to give. But also tracking everything is just very, very difficult when you have to make sure that all of this is maintained and done correctly. And so that's part of what we're scared about, of, oh my God, how are we going to do this? Because I can manipulate your hormone levels like nobody's business, but the legal stuff is not my gig.
Well, and you weren't a party to the contract. I mean, I can't tell you, for at least a decade here, we saw lots of contracts where it forced duties on the clinic, as if the clinic was a party to the contract and negotiated it and agreed to it. But you can't unilaterally decide that your lawyer or your doctor is going to do something for you that is not within their normal purview to do when they weren't a party to the contract.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Well, I super appreciate the conversation so much. This isn't the end of this conversation. We know this is going to be an ongoing thing into the future here. And like I said, that crystal ball depends on what happens with it. But can you, just for everybody that fell in love with you during the podcast, let them know where they can get information about your clinic and you?
So Fertility Center of Las Vegas is my clinic. Fertility Docs Uncensored is my podcast. And you can find us on all of the websites, fertilitycenterlv.com. There's easy ways to request appointments. We do a lot of telemedicine. Like I said, our clientele is international, and so we're set up pretty well to help people navigate across borders of all varieties. And we have quite a few translators, so we can handle Chinese, Mandarin, Spanish, French, German, several languages, not just the docs, but also among our staff as well to make things easier. So we're happy to help in any way possible. So give it a call.
It's worth it. You'll be in good hands. Travel to Las Vegas, utilize their clinic. You won't regret it. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Surrogacy Warrior. I hope you found our discussion enlightening and empowering. This is about warrior, the keyword warrior, and advocacy. And there's going to be a lot more advocacy work in this field of anonymous donations. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more listeners and give us the best idea of what content you possibly could want to listen to. Stay connected to us on social media and visit us on our website at www.lawyersforfamilies.com for far more resources, updates, blog information. Remember, you are not alone on this journey. Together we are warriors. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for your dreams.
You've been tuning into the Surrogacy Warrior podcast with your host, Kimberly Surratt. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, lawyersforfamilies.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.